Promise. Somewhere in the dry hills of the American West, there is a war you have never heard of. It killed more people than almost any other conflict on this soil. It burned homes, it emptied villages, and it broke families apart. Yet today, you will not find it in your school textbook. You will not find a statue for it in your town square. Most Americans could not even tell you its name. That is the promise of this story. We are going to dig up America's forgotten frontier wars, the battles, the massacres, and the quiet tragedies that history chose to bury. And by the end, we are going to answer one haunting question. Which of these forgotten wars was actually the deadliest Indian war in American history? The answer will surprise you. Some historians argue about it to this day. Keep watching, because the truth is stranger, sadder, and closer to home than you think. This is not a story about famous names like Custer or Sitting Bull. Those stories get told again and again. This is a story about the wars that slipped through the cracks of memory. Wars fought in places most people cannot find on a map. Wars where thousands died, and yet the world moved on like nothing happened. Picture a wide, empty desert. Wind moves through sagebrush. There are no signs, no markers, nothing to tell you that a war once raged across this exact ground. Somewhere under that dirt lie soldiers, mothers, children, and warriors who never got a proper burial. Somewhere in old newspaper archives and yellowed letters and tribal oral histories passed down in whispers, their stories still live. Tonight, we bring them back. By the time the story ends, you will know why some wars get remembered and others get erased. You will meet real people who lived through unbearable loss, and you will finally learn the answer to our opening question. The deadliest frontier war nobody talks about. Let's begin. The West. Nobody talks about. When most people picture the American frontier, they picture a simple story. Cowboys, wagon trains, a few famous battles, maybe a movie scene with soldiers on horses. But the real history of the American West was far messier, far bloodier, and far longer than any movie could show. Between the early 1600s and the late 1800s, more than 1,500 armed conflicts broke out between Native American nations and colonial or U.S. forces. Some were single skirmishes, others lasted for years. Most of them never made it into popular memory. They happened in places too remote for newspapers to notice, or they happened to people too poor or too powerless to have their stories written down. Take Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Most Americans have never heard the name, yet it was one of the first major armed uprisings in colonial America. It began as a conflict between English colonists and native tribes along the Virginia frontier, but it grew into something much bigger. Poor farmers, angry at the colonial government for not protecting them, took up arms not only against native nations, but eventually against the governor himself. Homes burned. The colonial capital was set on fire. Yet ask any student today about Bacon's Rebellion, and you will likely get a blank stare. Or think about Pontiac's War in 1763. An alliance of native nations, upset by British policies after the French and Indian War, launched a coordinated uprising across the Great Lakes region. They captured several British forts in just a few weeks. It was one of the most successful acts of native resistance in American history, and it forced the British government to change its entire approach to the frontier. Still, most people cannot name a single battle from this war. Why does this happen? Why do some wars become legends while others vanish completely? Part of the answer is simple. History gets written by whoever holds the pen. For most of American history, that pen belonged to settlers, soldiers, and government officials. Native nations kept their own histories, but for generations, those histories were dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed. Oral traditions were treated as myths instead of memory. Entire wars were reduced to a paragraph or left out completely. Another part of the answer is geography. Many of these forgotten wars happened far from major cities, in places with small populations and few reporters. A massacre in a remote desert canyon simply did not get the same attention as a battle near a growing city. No war correspondence, no photographs, sometimes not even an official report. And there is a darker reason too. Some of these wars are uncomfortable to remember. They involve massacres of unarmed people. They involve broken treaties. They involve tactics that do not fit neatly into a story of American heroism. It is easier to forget an atrocity than to sit with it. But forgetting does not undo what happened. The people who lived through these wars were real. Their fear was real. Their grief was real. Somewhere out there, descendants of the survivors still carry these stories, even if the rest of the country has let them fade. Tonight, we are going to look closely at two of these forgotten conflicts. One took place in a landscape so strange and jagged that soldiers described it like something from a nightmare. The other stretched across a vast stretch of desert and mountains, and it may be the very war we promised to reveal, the deadliest frontier war that history forgot. Let's step into the first one. The War in the Lava Beds. In the winter of 1872, in the far northern corner of California, a small group of Modoc people made a decision that would lead to one of the strangest and saddest conflicts of the American frontier. For years, the Modoc had lived along the California-Oregon border, near a lake and a stretch of land their ancestors had called home for generations. When settlers arrived, tensions grew quickly. The U.S. government pushed the Modoc onto a reservation shared with a rival tribe, the Klamath. Life on the reservation was difficult. Food was scarce. Old rivalries flared. A respected Modoc leader, known to history by an English nickname, Captain Jack, led a group of his people away from the reservation and back to their homeland along Lost River. For a while, they were left alone. But settlers who had claimed the land complained, and the U.S. Army was ordered to force the Modoc back onto the reservation. On a cold morning in November of 1872, soldiers arrived at the Modoc camp along Lost River. What happened next is still debated, but somewhere in the chaos, shots were fired. Men, women, and children scattered into the freezing water and the frozen brush. Some were killed instantly. Others fled into the night, some without shoes, some carrying infants, running for their lives across a landscape offering no mercy. The surviving Modoc, roughly 60 warriors along with more than 100 women, children, and elders, fled south into one of the strangest natural fortresses in North America. It is called the lava beds. Imagine a vast, cracked landscape of hardened black volcanic rock, twisted into caves, tunnels, ridges, and hidden trenches. It looks almost like the surface of another planet. The Modoc knew this land intimately. The soldiers did not. For the next several months, this tiny band of Modoc fighters, vastly outnumbered, held off hundreds of U.S. Army soldiers. Every attempt to storm their position ended in confusion and failure. Soldiers described trying to advance through the jagged rock, only to lose sight of each other within a few steps. Voices echoed strangely off the stone. Some soldiers said it felt like fighting an enemy who could vanish into the earth itself. Winter turned the lava beds into a place of brutal cold. Families huddled together in caves, rationing what little food they had. Children cried quietly so as not to give away their position. Mothers wrapped their babies in whatever cloth they could find, praying the cold would not take them in the night. Meanwhile, soldiers outside froze in their own camps, exhausted and demoralized, wondering how such a small group of people could hold out against an army. In April of 1873, a peace commission attempted to negotiate an end to the fighting. General Edward Canby, a respected officer known for his fairness, agreed to meet with Captain Jack and other Modoc leaders under a flag of truce. But deep divisions existed within the Modoc camp. Some believed peace was still possible. Others believed the only path forward was to strike a decisive blow. During that meeting, in a moment historians still describe with sorrow, violence broke out. General Canby was killed, becoming the only general officer to die in the entire history of the American Indian Wars. The peace talks collapsed instantly. Whatever chance existed for a peaceful resolution died with him in the lava rock that day. The army, now furious and humiliated, poured more soldiers and heavier weapons into the lava beds. Slowly, through starvation, exhaustion, and betrayal from within their own ranks, the Modoc resistance began to crumble. Eventually, some Modocs surrendered, and eventually so did Captain Jack himself. He was tried, along with several others, for the death of General Canby. He was executed in October of 1873. The remaining Modoc people, fewer than 150 in total, were forced onto a reservation far from their homeland in what is now Oklahoma. Their traditional lands, the lake, the river, the black volcanic rock they knew like the back of their hand, were gone from their lives forever. Some of their descendants did not return to their ancestral homeland until generations later. Think about the scale of this. Fewer than 200 people, including children and elders, held off the United States Army for months in one of the most dramatic standoffs in frontier history. It cost the Army dozens of soldiers, cost the Modoc almost everything they had, and cost a respected general his life. And yet, ask most Americans about the Modoc War, and you will get silence. This is the shape of a forgotten war. Small in numbers, but enormous in human cost, full of courage, full of heartbreak, and almost entirely missing from public memory. But even the Modoc War, as tragic as it was, is not the answer to our opening question. There is another war, larger, longer, and far bloodier, that remains even more obscure. To find it, we need to travel across a wider stretch of desert, into a conflict most people have never even heard named. The War Across the Desert. Between 1864 and 1868, across a vast stretch of what is now Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, and California, a brutal and sprawling conflict unfolded. Today, it is sometimes called the Snake War, named after the northern Paiute, Bannock, and Shoshone peoples who lived across this high desert region, sometimes referred to at the time by the general term Snake Indians. This was not one battle. It was not even one campaign. It was a scattered, grinding, years-long series of raids, ambushes, and killings spread across an area larger than some countries. And by the time it ended, it had produced casualty numbers higher than almost any other conflict in the history of the American Indian Wars. To understand why this war started, you have to understand what was happening to the land itself. Gold and silver had been discovered across the region. Miners poured in by the thousands. Settlers followed, along with stagecoach lines, telegraph routes, and military outposts. For the northern Paiute, Bannock, and Shoshone peoples, this meant their traditional hunting grounds, their water sources, and their food supplies were being taken over at an overwhelming pace. As settlers pushed further into the region, violence broke out on both sides. Raids on wagon trains and mining camps were met with retaliatory attacks on native villages. Both sides lost people. Both sides grew more desperate and more brutal as the years dragged on. The U.S. Army, stretched thin and distracted by the ongoing Civil War and its aftermath, struggled to respond in any organized way. Small forts were scattered across hundreds of miles of harsh desert terrain. Soldiers were sent on long, grueling patrols through blistering summers and freezing winters, chasing an enemy who knew the land far better than they did and who could disappear into canyons and lava fields at will. For the northern Paiute, Bannock, and Shoshone fighters, survival itself became a form of warfare. Villages were forced to move constantly to avoid attack. Food supplies, already stretched thin by the loss of hunting grounds, became even scarcer as families spent more time fleeing than gathering or hunting. Winters were especially deadly. Entire family groups sometimes died from exposure and starvation while trying to stay hidden from army patrols. One of the darkest moments of this long war came in January of 1863 at a place called Bear River in what is now southeastern Idaho. Although technically part of the broader conflict in this region, and considered by many historians as its horrifying opening chapter, the events at Bear River remain almost completely unknown to most Americans. On a bitterly cold winter morning, U.S. Army soldiers attacked a northern Shoshone winter encampment along the Bear River. What followed was not really a battle in any fair sense of the word. It was a massacre. Estimates vary, but historians believe that somewhere between 200 and 400 Shoshone men, women, and children were killed that day, making it one of the deadliest single attacks on Native Americans in United States history. Deadlier even than the more widely remembered massacre at Wounded Knee decades later. Survivors described soldiers wading into the freezing river to kill people trying to escape. They described homes and shelters burned to the ground in the brutal cold. They described a scene so devastating that some soldiers themselves were shaken by what they had done. And yet, for well over a century, this massacre received barely a mention in most American history books. It took decades of effort from Shoshone descendants and dedicated historians to bring the story back into public awareness, and even today, most Americans have still never heard of it. The Whiter Snake War continued for years after Bear River, spreading across the deserts of Oregon, Nevada, and Idaho. Small forts dotted the landscape, and soldiers described a war unlike anything else they had experienced. There were no grand battles with clear winners. Instead, there was a relentless, exhausting cycle of raids, ambushes, and pursuit through some of the harshest terrain in North America. By the time the fighting finally slowed in 1868, historians estimate that well over 1,000 people had died. A staggering number of them native men, women, and children caught in the crossfire of a war fought across an area the size of several states combined. Some historians, when accounting for the full years of conflict and the associated Bear River Massacre, argue that total casualties may have exceeded those of almost every other named conflict in the American Indian Wars, making this obscure, scattered desert war possibly the single deadliest of them all. Despite this staggering toll, the Snake War left behind almost no monuments, no famous names, and no place in popular memory. There was no dramatic surrender scene, no captured chief with a memorable name, no single decisive battle for history books to latch onto. It simply faded away, the way a fire fades into smoke and then into nothing, leaving behind only ash and silence. For the northern Paiute, Bannock, and Shoshone peoples who survived, the war meant the near total loss of their traditional way of life. Hunting grounds were gone. Villages were displaced onto reservations far smaller than the lands their ancestors had known. Families who had lived across this desert for countless generations were now confined to fractions of that land, trying to rebuild lives shattered by years of violence and loss. The answer. So here is the answer to the question we promised at the very beginning. When historians debate which frontier conflict deserves the grim title of deadliest Indian war in American history, the Snake War, stretching from 1864 to 1868 and including the horror of the Bear River Massacre, is one of the strongest and most disturbing answers. Its death toll, spread across years and hundreds of miles of desert, likely exceeds more famous conflicts that dominate our textbooks and documentaries. Think about that for a moment. A war more deadly than many of the ones we consider iconic pieces of American history, and most people alive today have never once heard its name. Why did this happen? Why did the Modoc War fade into obscurity despite its drama? Why did the Snake War, despite its staggering toll, disappear almost entirely from memory? Part of the answer lies in scale and spectacle. Wars with a single dramatic battle, a famous last stand, or a well-known chief are easier for history to hold on to. A scattered war across empty desert with no single decisive moment is harder to turn into a story people remember. Part of the answer lies in who was doing the remembering. For over a century, American history was written mostly by and for the descendants of settlers. Native accounts of these wars existed, passed down through oral tradition and community memory, but they were rarely included in official records or popular retellings. And part of the answer, the hardest part to admit, is that some of these wars showed a side of American expansion that did not fit comfortably into a story of progress and destiny. Massacres of women and children, scattered years of brutal desert warfare, the near erasure of entire ways of life. These are not comfortable stories to tell around a campfire of national pride, so for generations they were simply left out. But here's the truth that this story wants to leave you with. Forgetting a war does not erase its cost. It does not bring back a single life lost at Bear River or in the lava beds or across the desert trails of the Snake War. It only means that the people who suffered through it suffer twice, once in the moment of the violence itself, and again in the silence that followed for generations after. Why this matters today. Today, descendants of the Modoc, the Northern Paiute, the Bannock, and the Shoshone still live across the American West. Some live on reservations far smaller than the lands their ancestors once called home. Some have worked for decades to bring these forgotten stories back into public memory, pushing for historical markers, museum exhibits, and school curriculums that finally include the full truth of what happened on this land. Slowly, that work is paying off. Historical markers now stand at Bear River. Modoc history is taught more fully in parts of Oregon and California. Historians and tribal nations continue to piece together the full scope of the Snake War, filling in gaps left by more than a century of silence. Remembering these wars is not about assigning blame to people living today. It is about telling the full story of how this country came to look the way it does. It is about honoring the families who lost everything in these conflicts, and making sure their pain was not simply erased by time and convenience. Somewhere out in that quiet desert, wind still moves through the sagebrush over unmarked graves. Somewhere in the cracked black rock of the lava beds, the echoes of voices from 1872 have long since faded into silence. But the stories themselves do not have to fade. They can be carried forward, told honestly, and remembered by anyone willing to listen. That is the real promise of the story, not just to reveal one forgotten war, but to remind you that history is full of names, places, and people waiting quietly to be remembered. All it takes is someone willing to look. If this story moved you, share it, talk about it. Say the names Bear River, the lava beds, and the Snake War out loud to someone who has never heard them before. That is how forgotten history stops being forgotten.